Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages, that delightful 1,000-year stretch where everyone was perpetually one bad turnip away from disaster. Get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe fluff your pillow a bit. We're going to spend the next hour and a half wandering through centuries of questionable hygiene, dubious medical practices, and the surprisingly complicated question of just how long people actually lived back then. Because here's the thing about medieval life expectancy that most people get wrong. You've probably heard that people in the Middle Ages died at 30, right? That everyone was ancient by 25, and if you made it to 40 you were basically a wizened crone ready to dispense cryptic prophecies from your hovel. Well, sort of, but also not really. And the truth is somehow both better and worse than you'd think, which is very on brand for the Middle Ages. Let's start with the numbers, because nothing says drift off to sleep quite like statistics. The average life expectancy in medieval Europe was somewhere between 30 and 35 years. Sounds grim. Sounds like everyone was dropping dead in their prime, never getting to enjoy a proper midlife crisis or develop strong opinions about the neighborhood teens. But here's where it gets interesting, in that gentle, soporific way. That average is dragged down catastrophically by infant mortality. And I do mean catastrophically. See, if you were born in medieval Europe, you had roughly a 1 in 3 chance of dying before your 5th birthday. 1 in 3, just casually not making it to kindergarten age. Some estimates put it even higher, closer to 50% in certain regions and time periods. So right out of the gate, half the babies born just didn't continue, which is horrifying, obviously, but it does some interesting things to the math. Because if you actually survived childhood, made it past those treacherous first 5 years, your life expectancy suddenly looked a lot less bleak. A medieval person who reached adulthood could reasonably expect to live into their 50s or 60s. Not forever, certainly. Not retire to Florida and take up pickleball years, but a decent stretch, long enough to accumulate regrets and watch their own children struggle with the same 1 in 3 odds. So when we talk about medieval life expectancy, we're really talking about two very different experiences. There was the childhood gauntlet, which was basically a horror show, and then there was adulthood, which was, well, still not great, but survivable. Let's drift through both, shall we? Childbirth in the Middle Ages was, and I'm going to put this delicately, an absolute nightmare for everyone involved. The mother faced a genuinely significant risk of death every single time she gave birth. Somewhere between 1 and 2% of births resulted in maternal mortality, which doesn't sound like much until you remember that most women had 6, 7, 8 children. Suddenly those odds start stacking up in extremely unpleasant ways. There was no anesthesia, obviously, no understanding of germ theory, definitely no sterilization of anything. Midwives did their best, and many were genuinely skilled, but they were working with approximately zero medical knowledge and a whole lot of superstition. Think prayer, herbal remedies of dubious efficacy, and the occasional decision to strap an eagle stone to the mother's thigh because someone's grandmother swore it helped. An eagle stone, for the record, is a type of hollow rock. It did not help. Complications during birth were just complications. A breech birth, pray harder, hemorrhaging, more prayer, possibly some extremely unhelpful herbs, infection afterward. There wasn't even really a concept they understood yet. Women just got childbed fever and either recovered or didn't, and nobody quite knew why. Spoiler, it was bacteria. It was always bacteria, but they wouldn't figure that out for another few centuries. And if the mother survived, well, now you had an infant. A fragile, vulnerable infant in a world absolutely teeming with creative ways to die. Let's count them off, gently, soothingly, like the world's worst lullaby. Disease, obviously. Lots of disease. Measles, whooping cough, smallpox, diphtheria, scarlet fever. Any one of these could rip through a medieval household and carry off the children with casual efficiency. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no pediatric intensive care units, just children getting sick and parents watching helplessly, trying remedies that ranged from possibly somewhat helpful to actively making it worse. Malnutrition was another big one. Even in relatively prosperous households, children often didn't get enough to eat, or didn't get the right things to eat. Vitamin deficiencies were rampant. Rickets, scurvy, anemia all common. In poorer families, children were just perpetually hungry, their growth stunted, their immune systems compromised. And then when disease came knocking, they had nothing left to fight with. Accidents, because medieval homes were deeply unsafe places for small children. Open fires everywhere. Wells with no covers. Stairs with no railings. Animals that could kick, or bite, or trample. Tools and weapons just lying around. It was like someone designed a death trap, and then decided to raise children in it. Many parents tried to keep their kids safe, of course. But when you're working sun up to sundown just to survive, supervision was limited. And then there was simple neglect. Not usually intentional, but devastating nonetheless. Parents in the Middle Ages loved their children, despite what some historians used to claim. But they also lived in a world of scarcity and brutal practicality. If a child was sickly, if resources were limited, sometimes that child just didn't get the same care as their healthier siblings. It was a calculus of survival, grim and necessary and heartbreaking. So yes, 1 in 3 children didn't make it to age 5. 1 in 3. Let that settle over you, heavy and sad, as we drift forward. But let's say you were one of the lucky ones. You survived infancy. You survived early childhood. You made it to adolescence without being carried off by dysentery or diphtheria or an unfortunate encounter with a cow. Congratulations, your odds just improved dramatically. Not great odds, mind you. This is still the Middle Ages, but better. A medieval teenager who had survived the childhood gauntlet could reasonably expect to live into their 50s. If you were wealthy, noble, clergy, merchant class, you might make it into your 60s, or even 70s. It wasn't common, but it wasn't shocking either. Medieval people absolutely understood the concept of old age. They had grandparents, they had village elders, they had bishops who seemed to have been ancient since the dawn of time. The average gets pulled down though by the people who didn't make it, the ones who died in wars, in accidents, from sudden illness, from infected wounds, from any of the 1,000 small catastrophes that could end a life without warning. But if you avoided those, if you were reasonably careful and reasonably lucky, you could accumulate some decent mileage. Take peasants, for instance. If a peasant man survived to 21, he could expect to live to around 64. That's from actual manor records, analyzed by historians who clearly have more patience than I do. 64, not 30, not ancient Kronenhovel, actual, regular old age. They'd be weathered, certainly, worn down by decades of agricultural labor, probably missing some teeth, possibly harboring several untreated medical conditions, but alive, noble women who survived childbirth, which, remember, was a significant if, could also live well into their 60s or 70s. We have records of medieval queens and noblewomen living into their 80s, sharp-minded and politically active until the end. Eleanor of Aquitaine made it to 82, and she spent her 70s plotting against her sons and generally being a menace to everyone who de-annoyed her, which was most people. Monks and nuns, who didn't have to deal with the risks of childbirth or warfare, often lived the longest. They had regular meals, even if those meals were boring. They had some access to medical care, even if that care was mostly bloodletting and prayer. They had relatively safe living conditions. A medieval monk could easily make it into his 60s or 70s, spending his days copying manuscripts and complaining about the younger monks who didn't respect the old ways. So the picture we get is complicated. Infant mortality was absolutely catastrophic, dragging the average down into the basement. But the people who survived childhood weren't all dropping dead at 30. They were living lives of recognizable length, even if those lives were harder and more precarious than anything we deal with today. Let's drift now into what actually killed people once they'd made it past childhood, because it's a fascinating list, in a morbid, sleep-inducing sort of way. Some thought it was God's punishment for sin. Some blamed earthquakes or bad air or the alignment of planets. The plague came back, too, repeatedly. There were major outbreaks every few generations for centuries. It became part of the landscape of medieval life, this lurking terror that could emerge without warning and devastate everything. Builders fell from scaffolding. Miners got trapped in collapses. Sailors drowned. Blacksmiths burned themselves. Carpenters lost fingers or hands. Women faced additional risks from childbirth, as we discussed, but also from the simple fact of being women in a patriarchal society with no real legal protections. Entire neighborhoods could burn in hours. Drowning was common, especially since many people couldn't swim. Food poisoning from spoiled or contaminated food. Choking, because the Heimlich maneuver wouldn't be invented for another several centuries. Exposure to cold, if you were poor and couldn't afford adequate shelter or fuel. Even something as simple as a tooth infection could kill you. A bad tooth could abscess. The infection could spread to your jaw, then to your bloodstream, and suddenly you're dead from sepsis because of a cavity. This happened regularly. It was just another way the medieval world could kill you with casual efficiency. Let's drift now into medieval medicine, that fascinating intersection of desperate hope and complete ignorance. Because medieval people did try to treat illness and injury. They tried very hard, actually. They just had absolutely no idea what they were doing, which led to some truly creative approaches to healthcare. The foundation of medieval medicine was the theory of the four humours, inherited from ancient Greek physician Galen: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health, according to this theory, was a matter of keeping these four humours in balance. Illness meant your humours were out of whack, and treatment meant rebalancing them. This theory was completely wrong, obviously, but it made a certain kind of internal sense. And it dominated medical thinking for over 1,000 years. So if you went to a medieval physician complaining of a fever, they'd diagnose you with an excess of blood. Too much blood, making you hot and flushed. The solution: remove some blood. Bloodletting: they'd either make small cuts to let blood flow out, or they'd apply leeches, which would attach themselves and drink their fill. This was supposed to restore balance and cure your fever. Did it work? No, it did not work. It made you weaker and more vulnerable to infection. But occasionally, people recovered anyway, because the human body is resilient. And then the physician could point to the bloodletting as proof of its effectiveness. Confirmation bias has been ruining medical care for millennia. Bloodletting was used for everything. Fever, bloodletting. Headache, bloodletting. Broken bone. Believe it or not, bloodletting. They'd even do preventative bloodletting, draining blood from healthy people just to keep their humors balanced. Barbers performed bloodletting, which is why the traditional barber pole is red and white, red for blood, white for the bandages. Fun fact to drift off on, but bloodletting was just the beginning. Medieval physicians had a whole arsenal of treatments, none of which worked, all of which they prescribed with complete confidence. Purging, for instance, if bloodletting removed bad humors through blood, purging removed them through, well, the other end. They'd give you powerful laxatives or emetics to induce vomiting or diarrhea. The theory being that you'd expel the excess bile causing your illness. This mostly just left you dehydrated and miserable. But again, sometimes people recovered anyway. Cauterization, which involved burning the skin with hot irons. This was used to treat wounds, seal bleeding, or burn out infection. It was agonizingly painful, often made things worse by damaging healthy tissue, and had a high risk of infection afterward. But it looked like you were doing something, which was important to medieval physicians, who charged good money for their services, trepanation, or drilling holes in the skull. This was done for severe headaches, epilepsy, mental illness, or head injuries. The theory was that you were releasing pressure or letting out evil spirits, or rebalancing humors, depending on who you asked. Amazingly, some people survived this procedure, probably because the human skull is remarkably tough. Most didn't. And then there were the herbal remedies, which were at least occasionally helpful. Medieval people had extensive knowledge of local plants and their properties. Some of these remedies actually worked. Willow bark for pain relief contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Foxglove for heart problems, it contains digitalis, still used today. Opium poppies for severe pain. Well, opium definitely works for pain, even if it comes with some notable side effects. But for every helpful herb, there were dozens of useless or actively harmful ones. Hemlock for, well, anything, even though it's poisonous. Mandrake root, which was supposed to cure everything but mostly just made you hallucinate. Theriac, a supposed cure-all that contained dozens of ingredients, including viper, flesh, and opium, and which was basically medieval snake oil in the most literal sense possible. Medieval physicians also prescribed dietary changes, based on the theory that different foods had different humoral properties. Hot and dry foods for patients with too much phlegm, cold and wet foods for patients with too much yellow bile. This led to elaborate food categorization systems that made absolutely no sense but were taken very seriously. Eating the wrong thing could supposedly make your illness worse. So medieval sick people were often put on incredibly restricted diets that left them malnourished on top of everything else. And of course, there was prayer. Lots and lots of prayer. Medieval people believed that illness could be a punishment from God, a test of faith, or the result of demonic influence. So alongside any medical treatment, you'd pray. You'd make offerings at shrines. You'd go on pilgrimages to holy sites known for miraculous cures. You'd pay for masses to be said for your recovery. Some saints were associated with specific ailments. Saint Apollonia for toothaches, because she'd had her teeth knocked out during her martyrdom. Saint Sebastian for plague, because he'd been shot full of arrows and survived, making him a patron of any disease that came at you from outside. Saint Vitus for epilepsy, Saint Roch for plague, Saint Lucy for eye problems, and on and on. You could find a saint for just about any medical issue, and people absolutely did, hedging their bets by covering both medical and spiritual bases. Did prayer work? Well, it provided comfort, which isn't nothing. It gave people a sense of control in situations where they had none. Sometimes people recovered, and they'd attribute it to divine intervention, which strengthened their faith. And faith, we know now, can actually have positive effects on health outcomes, though not in the miraculous way medieval people imagined. But mostly, Medieval medicine was just ineffective, and the people practicing it knew it on some level. They saw that most of their treatments didn't work. They saw patients die despite their best efforts, but they didn't have better options, didn't have the scientific knowledge to develop better treatments. So they kept doing what they'd always done, because doing something felt better than doing nothing. Let's take a moment here to appreciate modern medicine, antibiotics, vaccines, anesthesia, actual knowledge of how the human body works. We live in miraculous times, medically speaking. A medieval peasant would weep with joy at the idea of popping an ibuprofen for a headache instead of having their humors rebalanced with the lancet. Let's settle back into the plague for a bit longer, because we really can't overstate how much it shaped medieval life and death. The Black Death of 1347 to 1353 was just the opening act. Plague became a recurring visitor to Europe, showing up every decade or so for the next few centuries, like that relative who drops by unannounced and ruins everything. The thing about plague is that it was wildly unpredictable. Some outbreaks would devastate entire regions, others would burn through a single city and then fade. Some years it barely appeared at all, other years it killed thousands. Medieval people just had to live with this randomness, never knowing when the next outbreak would hit, never knowing if they'd be among the lucky survivors or the unlucky dead. Cities were particularly vulnerable. Cramped living conditions, poor sanitation, rats everywhere. It was basically a perfect plague incubator. When an outbreak hit a medieval city, the wealthy would flee to their country estates, abandoning the urban poor to their fate. This was just accepted practice. If you could afford to run, you ran. If you couldn't, well, you stayed and hoped. Some cities tried quarantine measures. Venice, always ahead of the curve, established the first quarantine system in 1374. Ships coming from plague-infected areas had to anchor offshore for 40 days. 40 giorni in Italian, which is where we get the word quarantine. If nobody on board developed symptoms during those 40 days, they could dock and unload. If someone did get sick, well, the ship stayed put, and everyone on board probably died. Other cities established pest houses, basically isolation hospitals for plague victims. If you showed symptoms, you'd be taken from your home and locked in a pest house with other infected people. The theory was that this would prevent the disease from spreading. In practice, it just meant that sick people died in slightly more organized fashion, while their families were left to fend for themselves. The mortality rate from plague was horrific. Somewhere between 50 to 90% of people who contracted it died, depending on which form they caught. The bubonic form, with the characteristic buboes, had the best survival rate, if you can call 50% best. The pneumonic form, which attacked the lungs, was almost always fatal. The septicemic form, where the infection spread to the bloodstream, killed quickly and inevitably, and the deaths were terrible. The buboes were agonizing, swollen and dark, and sometimes bursting. The fever was intense. People became delirious, hallucinating, unable to recognize their own families. The pneumonic form meant drowning in your own fluids, gasping for air that wouldn't come. It was not a peaceful way to go. Families were torn apart. Parents watched their children die. Children watched their parents die. Sometimes entire households were wiped out, with no one left to bury the dead. Bodies would be discovered weeks later, decomposing in their homes, because there was no one to check on them and no one willing to risk infection by entering. The psychological trauma must have been immense. Survivors had to live with the memory of those deaths, the guilt of surviving when others didn't, the constant fear that plague would return and claim them too. Some people became deeply religious, convinced that the plague was God's punishment and that repentance was the only defense. Others became fatalistic, living for the moment because tomorrow might not come. There were some truly bizarre responses to the plague. The flagellants, for instance. These were groups of people who would travel from town to town, publicly whipping themselves with leather straps embedded with metal spikes. They believed that by mortifying their flesh, they could atone for humanity's sins and convince God to end the plague. They'd process through streets, bloody and chanting, drawing crowds of onlookers who were probably thinking, well, This seems excessive. The flagellant movement grew quite large during the worst plague years, with thousands of participants. The Church eventually condemned it, partly because the flagellants were operating outside official religious authority, partly because they were stirring up apocalyptic fervor and anti-Semitic violence. But for a while there, public self-flagellation was just another feature of the plague-haunted medieval landscape. And then there were the plague doctors, who deserved their own moment of appreciation. These were physicians who specialized in treating plague victims, or at least attempting to. They wore those famous beaked masks, you've probably seen them. They looked like creepy bird costumes. The beak was stuffed with herbs and spices, because they believed plague was spread by bad air, miasma, and the strong smells would protect them. They also wore long waxed coats, gloves, and wide-brimmed hats. The whole outfit was meant to create a barrier between the doctor and the diseased air. Did it work? Well, not really, since plague is spread by flea bites and respiratory droplets, not by bad smells. But the outfit probably did provide some incidental protection by covering most of their body and creating a small barrier against fleas. Plague doctors would examine victims, lance buboes, prescribe useless treatments, and certify deaths. It was dangerous work, and many plague doctors died themselves. But they were well paid, because nobody else wanted to do it, and someone had to. They became these iconic figures, wandering through plague-stricken cities in their bird masks, harbingers of death themselves. The economic impact of plague was staggering. So many people died that there was a labor shortage across Europe. Suddenly peasants had bargaining power, because lords needed workers and there weren't enough to go around. Wages rose. Working conditions improved slightly. Some serfs were able to negotiate their freedom. The feudal system began to crack under the strain. Land that had been cultivated for generations was abandoned. Entire villages disappeared, their inhabitants dead or fled. You can still see the remnants in England medieval village sites that are now just faint earthworks in fields, ghosts of communities erased by plague. The church's authority was damaged too. People had prayed, had followed all the religious prescriptions, and the plague had killed them anyway. Clergy had died at high rates because they tended to the sick and performed last rites. The survivors began to question whether God was really listening, whether the church really had special access to divine favor. This skepticism would eventually contribute to the Reformation, though that was still a couple centuries away. But let's drift away from plague for a moment. Let's talk about some other medieval health hazards, the less dramatic but still deadly threats that stalked daily life. Food security was a constant concern in the Middle Ages. Not for everyone, nobles and wealthy. Merchants generally ate well, but for the peasant majority, hunger was a regular companion, and famine was an ever-present threat. Medieval agriculture was precarious. Yields were low by modern standards. Farming techniques were primitive. There were no chemical fertilizers, no pesticides, no hybrid crops bred for resilience and productivity. Just farmers working fields with wooden plows and ox teams, hoping for good weather and a decent harvest. When the weather cooperated, there was enough food, not an abundance, not variety, but enough. Peasants ate a lot of bread, a lot of pottage basically, vegetable stew and, occasionally some cheese or eggs. Meat was rare, reserved for feast days and special occasions. It was a monotonous diet, nutritionally inadequate, but survivable. When the weather didn't cooperate, people starved. A wet spring could rot the seeds in the ground. A dry summer could wither the crops in the fields. An early frost could destroy the harvest before it could be gathered. And medieval Europe had no large-scale food storage, no efficient transportation system to move grain from surplus regions to deficit ones. If your region had a bad harvest, you just went hungry. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was particularly brutal. It started with heavy rains that ruined crops across northern Europe. The rains continued through 1316, destroying that year's harvest too. By 1317, people were starving en masse. Grain prices skyrocketed. The poor ate their seed grain, meaning they had nothing to plant for the next year. They slaughtered their draft animals for food, meaning they couldn't plow their fields even if they had seed. The mortality rate during the Great Famine was around 10 to 25% in affected areas. 10 to 25% of the population dead from starvation and starvation-related disease. Because when you're malnourished, your immune system collapses, and any illness that comes along can kill you. Dysentery, typhoid, pneumonia diseases that a well-fed person might survive became death sentences for the starving. People resorted to desperate measures. They ate grass, tree bark, roots, anything that might have some nutritional value. There are documented cases of cannibalism, parents eating dead children, people digging up corpses for food. It was, by all accounts, a horror show that traumatized an entire generation, and this wasn't unique. Famines happened regularly throughout the Middle Ages, whenever weather patterns shifted or wars disrupted agriculture. The chroniclers noted them matter-of-factly. There was a great famine, many died, just another catastrophe in a long series of catastrophes. Even in non-famine years, malnutrition was endemic among the poor. They simply didn't get enough calories, enough protein, enough vitamins and minerals. Children grew up stunted, their development delayed, their bodies never reaching their genetic potential. Adults were smaller, weaker, more vulnerable to disease and injury. Vitamin deficiencies caused specific diseases: scurvy from lack of vitamin C, bleeding gums, loose teeth, fatigue, eventually death; rickets from lack of vitamin D, soft, deformed bones, bowlegs, stunted growth; pellagra from lack of niacin, dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, death; night blindness from lack of vitamin A, anemia from lack of iron. The wealthy didn't have these problems, or at least not as severely. They ate meat regularly, had access to fresh fruits and vegetables in season, could afford imported spices and delicacies. They still had nutritional gaps even. Noble diets were heavy on meat and light on vegetables, but they weren't chronically malnourished the way peasants were. This created a visible class divide. Nobles were taller, healthier, stronger. Peasants were shorter, sicklier, more worn down. You could literally see someone's social class in their body, in how tall they stood, how straight their bones grew, how many teeth they'd retained. Inequality was written into the flesh. Food preservation was another challenge. Without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly. Meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried. Grain had to be kept dry and protected from rodents and insects. Milk turned into cheese because cheese lasted longer. Fruits were preserved in honey or dried. Everything was about making food last from one harvest to the next. This meant that by late winter and early spring, even in good years, food supplies were running low. The previous year's harvest was depleted. The new crops weren't ready yet. This period was called the Hungry Gap, and it was when malnutrition peaked, when people were at their weakest, when disease could sweep through and kill with ease. Food safety was basically non-existent. There were no food safety regulations, no health inspections, no concept of foodborne bacteria. Meat was sold until it spoiled, and even then, you might cook it and eat it anyway, because you couldn't afford to waste it. Milk was unpasteurized and often contaminated. Water was frequently polluted with sewage and industrial runoff. This led to constant low-level food poisoning, stomach aches, diarrhea, vomiting, just part of life. Sometimes it got worse. Ergot, poisoning from contaminated rye, could cause hallucinations, convulsions. Gangrene, botulism from improperly preserved food, could cause paralysis and death. Lead poisoning from pewter dishes and lead-lined storage vessels caused gradual neurological damage. And then there were the adulterated foods. Bakers would stretch flour with sawdust or chalk. Brewers would water down beer. Merchants would sell spoiled food that had been disguised with spices. This wasn't unusual or particularly scandalous. It was just how commerce worked in a world without consumer protections or quality standards. The constant malnutrition had long-term effects on life expectancy. People with inadequate nutrition throughout childhood and adolescence entered adulthood with compromised health. Their organs didn't function as well. Their bones were weaker. Their immune systems were less robust. They aged faster and died younger than they would have with better nutrition. So when we talk about medieval life expectancy, we have to factor in this baseline of hunger and malnutrition that affected the majority of the population. They weren't dying just from disease and violence. They were dying because their bodies never had the resources to be truly healthy in the first place. Let's drift forward now into some specific royal examples, because nothing says bedtime story quite like tales of inbred monarchs and their various medical catastrophes. If you want to understand what happens when royal families take the whole keep it in the family thing way too seriously, look no further than the Spanish Habsburgs. They were a masterclass in dynastic mismanagement, genetic disaster, and the slow-motion collapse of a ruling family through sheer stubborn commitment to marrying their cousins. The Habsburgs were one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, controlling vast territories across Europe and the New World. They were Holy Roman Emperors, kings of Spain, rulers of Austria, and they maintained this power through strategic marriages. The problem was that they had a very limited definition of strategic. See, the Habsburgs wanted to keep their wealth and power consolidated within the family. They didn't want to dilute their holdings by marrying into other dynasties. So they married each other. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. The family tree started to look less like a tree and more like a tangled wreath. This went on for generations. Each generation, the gene pool got a little shallower, a little more concentrated. Recessive traits that would normally be diluted by genetic diversity started to express themselves, and the Habsburgs developed some, shall we say, distinctive features. The Habsburg jaw, for instance, officially called mandibular prognathism. It's a condition where the lower jaw protrudes significantly beyond the upper jaw. It gives the face a distinctive profile, makes chewing difficult, and causes speech impediments. The Habsburgs had it bad, and it got worse with each generation of inbreeding. We can track this through portraits. Early Habsburgs had relatively normal facial structure. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the Habsburg jaw was prominent in every family member. Artists tried to minimize it, painting from flattering angles, but you can still see it, that jutting lower jaw, that difficulty closing the mouth properly. It screams too many cousins married each other, but the jaw was just the most visible problem. The Habsburgs also suffered from reduced fertility, higher rates of infant mortality, developmental delays, and various health issues that made their lives shorter and more miserable than they needed to be. And then we get to Charles II of Spain, the final and most catastrophic product of Habsburg inbreeding. Charles was born in 1661, the long-awaited son and heir of Philip IV. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandmothers were sisters. His family tree was less a tree and more a telephone pole with a few branches that looped back on themselves. Charles was not well. Even by the standards of inbred royalty, Charles was a disaster. He couldn't walk until he was 8 years old. He didn't talk until he was 4, and even then his speech was almost unintelligible, partly because of his massive Habsburg jaw, partly because his tongue was too large for his mouth. He had the Habsburg jaw in its most extreme form. His lower teeth stuck out far beyond his upper teeth. He couldn't chew his food properly, so he just swallowed chunks whole, leading to constant digestive problems. He drooled uncontrollably. His tongue was so large that it interfered with his breathing and speaking. He was short, weak, and sickly. He suffered from seizures. He had frequent illnesses. His legs were so weak that he needed support to walk even as an adult. He was probably infertile, though he married twice in desperate attempts to produce an heir. Both marriages were childless, and contemporary accounts suggest he might not have been capable of consummating them. Mentally, Charles was described as simple and slow. Modern analysis of his documented symptoms suggests he probably had multiple genetic disorders, including combined pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis. Basically, his endocrine system didn't work properly, and his kidneys couldn't process waste efficiently. The inbreeding coefficient for Charles II was 0.254. For context, the inbreeding coefficient for a child of full siblings is 0.25. Charles's parents weren't full siblings, but generations of intermarriage meant that he had roughly the same level of genetic diversity as if they had been. A quarter of his genes came from identical copies. It's frankly remarkable that he survived to adulthood at all. Charles died at 38, having suffered through his entire life. He had no heir, which meant the Spanish Habsburg line ended with him. His death triggered the War of Spanish Succession, a massive European conflict over who would inherit the Spanish throne. The dynasty that had ruled Spain for nearly 200 years ended not with conquest or revolution, but with a sickly king who could unproduce children because his ancestors could unstop marrying their relatives. The Spanish Habsburgs are an extreme example, but they weren't unique. Royal families across Europe practiced intermarriage to varying degrees, and they all paid genetic prices for it. The more isolated and insular a dynasty became, the worse the problems got. Let's drift over to some other royal genetic misadventures, shall we? If the Habsburgs specialized in jaw problems, the royal families of Europe had another genetic catastrophe to contend with: hemophilia, specifically hemophilia B, though they didn't know that at the time. They just knew that some princes and heirs apparent had a terrifying tendency to bleed uncontrollably from the slightest injury. The story starts with Queen Victoria of Britain, who was a carrier for hemophilia. She didn't have the disease herself. It's X-linked, meaning women need 2 copies of the mutated gene to express it, while men only need 1. But she carried 1 copy, and she passed it to several of her children. Victoria had 9 children who survived to adulthood, and she married them off to royal families across Europe, earning her the nickname Grandmother of Europe. This was standard practice for monarch strategic marriages to create alliances and consolidate power. Unfortunately, it also meant she spread hemophilia throughout European royalty like a very slow, very bloody chain letter. Her son Leopold had hemophilia and died at 30 from a brain hemorrhage after a minor fall. Her daughters Alice and Beatrice were carriers, and they passed the gene to their children. Through them, hemophilia entered the German, Russian, and Spanish royal families. Hemophilia meant that even minor injuries could be life-threatening. A small cut that would heal quickly in a normal person could bleed for hours or days in a hemophiliac. Internal bleeding from bumps or falls could cause joint damage, organ damage, brain hemorrhages. There was no treatment beyond rest and hope, and even that didn't always work. For royal children with hemophilia, childhood was a minefield. They had to be protected from normal childhood activities. No rough play, no climbing, no running around. Any accident could be fatal. Their parents lived in constant fear, watching for signs of bleeding, knowing that a bad fall or a deep bruise could kill their child. The most famous hemophiliac royal was Tsarevich Alexei of Russia, the only son and heir of Tsar Nicholas II. Alexei's mother, Alexandra, was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria and a carrier. Alexei inherited the disease and suffered terribly from it throughout his short life. He had numerous bleeding episodes, some of them nearly fatal. His joints would swell with internal bleeding, causing excruciating pain. He couldn't walk for weeks or months at a time. The royal family kept his condition secret as much as possible, because admitting the heir was gravely ill would have undermined the dynasty's stability. Alexandra, desperate to help her son, turned to Grigory Rasputin, a mystic and faith healer who claimed he could ease Alexei's suffering, and, bizarrely, he could. When Alexei was in pain, Rasputin would be summoned, and the boy's condition would improve. Modern historians think Rasputin might have encouraged the family to stop giving Alexei aspirin, which thins the blood and would have made the bleeding worse. Or maybe it was just psychological Rasputin's confidence calming the boy, reducing his stress, allowing his body to clot more effectively. Whatever the mechanism, Rasputin's influence over the royal family grew enormous, which contributed to public distrust of the monarchy and ultimately to the Russian Revolution. So, in a roundabout way, hemophilia helped bring down the Romanov dynasty. Alexei died at 13 anyway, executed along with his family by Bolshevik revolutionaries. The hemophilia didn't kill him, but it shaped his life and his family's fate. Hemophilia appeared in other royal lines too. Queen Victoria's descendants in the Spanish royal family included several hemophiliacs. Prince Alfonso of Spain died at 31 from internal bleeding after a minor car accident. Prince Gonzalo died at 19 from injuries in another car accident. Complications from hemophilia, ensuring relatively minor injuries, became fatal. The gene gradually disappeared from royal families, as carriers either didn't have children or had daughters who married outside royal circles, breaking the chain of inheritance. But for several generations, hemophilia was a spectre haunting European palaces, a reminder that even royalty couldn't escape the consequences of their inbred family trees. The irony, of course, is that the very strategies meant to preserve royal bloodlines, careful marriages between royal families, keeping power concentrated, created the conditions for genetic diseases to flourish. If European royals had married more widely, if they'd introduced genetic diversity into their lines, hemophilia would have been diluted and might have disappeared. Instead, they created a closed system where genetic disasters could accumulate and spread. It's a good lesson in unintended consequences, though probably not one that will help you fall asleep. Let's move on to something slightly less blood-soaked. We touched on this earlier, but let's really sink into the grim reality of medieval childbirth, because it deserves its own extended meditation. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was genuinely one of the most dangerous things a woman could do, and most women did it multiple times. The maternal mortality rate was somewhere between 1 to 2% per birth. That doesn't sound too terrible until you remember that most women had 6, 7, 8 pregnancies. Some had 10 or more. Suddenly that 1 to 2% compounds into a lifetime risk of 5 to 10% or higher. 1 in 10 or 20 women dying from childbirth complications. Those are terrible odds, and there was no way to opt out. Marriage meant children, and women had little control over their reproductive lives. No reliable contraception, no safe abortion options, no C-sections that the mother could survive, just pregnancy after pregnancy, each one carrying that same grim statistical risk. The actual process of giving birth was attended by midwives, not physicians. Physicians were men, and they generally didn't attend. Birthsit was considered women's work, beneath their dignity. So midwives handled it, drawing on traditional knowledge passed down through generations. Some midwives were skilled and experienced, genuinely helpful in managing labor and delivery. Others were less knowledgeable, working with folk beliefs and superstitions rather than practical medical knowledge. But even the best midwife was working without any modern medical tools or knowledge. No anesthesia, no antibiotics, no real understanding of what could go wrong or how to fix it. Labor could last hours or even days. Women gave birth in their homes, usually in a darkened room with female relatives and the midwife in attendance. They'd labor standing up, sitting in a birthing chair, or squatting, whatever position felt most natural. Lying down on a bed didn't become standard until later, and it was actually less efficient for delivery. If labor progressed normally, if the baby was positioned correctly, if there were no complications, it could go relatively smoothly. The mother would be exhausted, in pain, but alive. The baby would be born, hopefully breathing and healthy. The midwife would cut the umbilical cord, deliver the placenta, and the mother would begin her recovery. But so many things could go wrong. The baby could be breech, positioned feet first or sideways. The midwife would try to turn it manually, reaching inside and attempting to manipulate the baby into the correct position. This was agonizing for the mother and often unsuccessful. If they couldn't turn the baby, the mother might labor for days, exhausting herself, before either dying or delivering a dead child. The placenta could fail to deliver, staying inside and causing hemorrhaging or infection. The umbilical cord could wrap around the baby's neck, strangling it during delivery. The mother could hemorrhage from torn tissue or a ruptured uterus. These complications could kill quickly, within minutes or hours, too fast for anyone to do much beyond pray. Even if the delivery itself went well, infection afterward was a major killer. Childbed fever, puerperal fever, was caused by bacterial infection, usually introduced during delivery. The midwife's hands weren't sterile. The birthing environment wasn't sterile. Bacteria would enter through tears in the vaginal or uterine tissue, and the mother would develop a fever, become delirious, and often die within days. Nobody understood why this happened. They didn't know about bacteria or sterilization. Some midwives washed their hands, some didn't. Some used clean cloths, some used whatever was available. It was all a matter of luck and local custom rather than evidence-based medicine. There were attempts to help women through difficult labors. Saints were invoked. Relics were brought to the bedside. Saint's bone fragment, or a piece of holy cloth, meant to bring divine assistance. Special prayers were said. Herbal remedies were administered, some of which might have had mild pain-relieving properties, most of which did nothing. For wealthy women, there were more resources. They could afford experienced midwives, comfortable birthing rooms, better nutrition during pregnancy, but even wealth couldn't guarantee survival. Royal women died in childbirth with depressing regularity, despite having access to the best care medieval medicine could provide. Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, died from postnatal complications shortly after giving birth to Edward VI. She developed puerperal fever and died 12 days after delivery. Henry VIII lost another wife, Catherine Howard, to execution rather than childbirth. But his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had multiple pregnancies with only one surviving child. The rest were stillbirths or infant deaths. Medieval women knew the risks. They'd seen sisters, mothers, friends die in childbirth. They knew that every pregnancy might be their last. Some women made wills before giving birth, settling their affairs in case they didn't survive. Others made peace with their families, said goodbye to existing children, just in case. And yet they had little choice but to keep trying, keep bearing children, because that was a wife's duty and a woman's role. The pressure to produce heirs, especially male heirs, was immense. A woman who couldn't have children, or who only had daughters, was considered a failure, grounds for divorce or annulment, so they kept risking their lives, pregnancy after pregnancy, hoping they'd be among the survivors. The psychological weight of this must have been crushing, living with the knowledge that every pregnancy was a dice roll with death, watching other women die and wondering if you'd be next, knowing that even if you survived this birth, there would be another pregnancy eventually, another roll of the dice. And for the children who were born, their survival wasn't guaranteed either. We've talked about infant mortality, but let's really sit with it for a moment. 1 in 3 children dead before age 5. Parents would have multiple children knowing that only some would survive to adulthood. They'd name children after dead siblings, reusing names because the first bearer of that name hadn't lived long enough to keep it. Did medieval parents love their children? Yes, absolutely. The historical idea that they were emotionally distant, that high infant mortality made them indifferent to child death, has been thoroughly debunked. They mourned their dead children. They grieved. They felt the same pain any parent feels at losing a child. But they also had to be somewhat fatalistic about it, because the alternative was being emotionally destroyed every time a child died. They had to find a way to keep going, to keep having children, to keep building their families even as death picked off members with casual frequency. This is the reality of medieval life expectancy. It wasn't just numbers and statistics. It was lived experience, daily uncertainty, constant grief. It was women dying in childbirth and children dying in infancy, and everyone just trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to kill them. Let's drift somewhere slightly less bleak, shall we? Let's talk about medieval old age, for those lucky enough to reach it. If you survived childhood, survived your reproductive years, avoided plague and famine and violence, you might actually make it to old age in the Middle Ages, and then you'd face a whole new set of challenges. Because medieval society wasn't exactly designed with elderly comfort in mind. First, the good news. Medieval people who reached old age weren't automatically decrepit. Many remained active, working well into their 60s and beyond. Peasant farmers kept farming, craftsmen kept crafting, nobles kept managing their estates and playing politics. Mental acuity often remained sharp, and physical ability, while declining, didn't necessarily vanish. We have records of medieval people living into their 70s, 80s, even 90s while remaining relatively functional. They were weathered, certainly, worn down by decades of hard labor or childbearing or just general medieval living, but they weren't all hobbling around waiting to die. That said, aging in the Middle Ages came with some specific challenges. Arthritis was nearly universal among elderly people, especially those who'd done heavy physical labor, decades of farming, carrying heavy loads, working in cold and damp conditions. It all took a toll on joints. Many elderly people dealt with chronic pain, reduced mobility, hands that wouldn't grip properly anymore. Dental health deteriorated badly. By old age, most medieval people had lost multiple teeth, either to decay, infection, or just wear. Their remaining teeth would be ground down to nubs from years of chewing coarse bread filled with stone grit from the milling process. This made eating difficult, limiting their diet to soft foods, which could contribute to malnutrition. Vision problems were common, and cataracts would develop, gradually clouding vision until the person was functionally blind. There was no cataract surgery, no corrective lenses. For most of history, glasses weren't invented until the late 13th century, and even then they were expensive and limited in availability. So elderly people just went blind and had to adapt. Hearing loss happened frequently. Years of exposure to loud noises, blacksmiths, bells, shouting over wind and weather damaged hearing. Medieval people didn't have hearing protection, didn't understand the concept of protecting their ears. So by old age, many were partially or completely deaf. There was no social security, no pension system, no retirement savings. If you couldn't work anymore, you depended on your family to support you. Most elderly people lived with adult children or other relatives who'd taken them in. This worked reasonably well in cultures with strong family obligations, where caring for elderly parents was considered a duty. But not everyone had family willing or able to care for them. Some elderly people were left destitute, begging for survival, dependent on charity. Churches and monasteries provided some assistance, almshouses, where elderly poor could live, distributions of bread and ale. But resources were limited, and many elderly people just struggled through. The very elderly, those who reached their 80s or 90s, often did become quite frail. Dementia was recognized, though not understood. Families would care for elderly relatives who no longer recognized them, who couldn't control their bodily functions, who'd become like children again. It was difficult, heartbreaking, and just another burden in lives already full of burdens. Society's attitude toward the elderly was mixed. There was some respect for age, and experienced elderly people might be consulted for advice, their memories of past events valued. In peasant communities, elderly people who could no longer farm might watch children, tell stories, perform light tasks that kept them useful and integrated. But there was also impatience and resentment, especially if elderly people were seen as burdensome or demanding. Resources were scarce, and elderly people who couldn't contribute were consuming food and space that others needed. This tension exists in many societies, but it was particularly acute in the resource-constrained medieval world. Some elderly people found refuge in monasteries or convents, entering religious life in their final years. This provided them with food, shelter, community, and spiritual preparation for death. It was a practical arrangement. They'd often donate whatever property or savings they had to the monastery in exchange for lifelong care. Death in old age was generally from what we now recognize as chronic conditions that finally became acute: heart failure, stroke, pneumonia, kidney failure. Medieval people didn't have those specific diagnoses, but they understood that the body wore out, that organs stopped functioning, that eventually the machine just stopped running. There was some attempt at elderly care: herbal remedies for pain, hot baths for aching joints, gentle massage. These weren't curative, but they provided some comfort. And there was emotional care, companionship, storytelling, making sure the elderly person wasn't alone and forgotten. Death was handled differently than in modern Western society. It was more integrated into daily life, less medicalized and hidden away. Elderly people often died at home, surrounded by family. There'd be last rites from a priest, final confessions, deathbed blessings for children and grandchildren. Then the family would prepare the body, hold a wake, arrange burial. Grief was expected and allowed. People would mourn their dead parents and grandparents, but there was also acceptance, a recognition that death in old age was natural and right, the proper end to a life well lived. It wasn't the tragedy that a young death was. So medieval old age was complicated. It wasn't pleasant by modern standards: chronic pain, declining abilities, dependence on others. But for those who reached it, it was also an achievement, a marker of luck and resilience. They'd survived everything the medieval world had thrown at them. That counted for something. Let's drift now into our final section, a gentle wind down through some miscellaneous observations about medieval mortality and how we think about it now. Here we are, approaching the end of our long, drowsy journey through medieval mortality. We've covered plague and famine, inbred royals and hemophiliac heirs, childbirth horrors and infant deaths, the grinding poverty of daily medieval life. It's been a tour of humanity at its most vulnerable, most precarious, most unlucky. Continue 1810, and yet, medieval people lived their lives. They loved their families, celebrated festivals, told jokes, made art, built cathedrals that still stand today. They weren't just victims of their circumstances, passive sufferers waiting for death. They were people, complex and capable, making the best of a genuinely difficult situation. Life expectancy tells us something important about a society: how well it feeds its people, protects them from disease, provides basic safety and security. By that measure, medieval Europe was failing badly. Too many children died. Too many women died in childbirth. Too many people died from preventable diseases, from hunger, from violence. But life expectancy doesn't tell us everything. It doesn't capture subjective experience, moments of joy and beauty, the satisfaction of work well done, the comfort of community. Medieval people had those things, even in their short, precarious lives. They weren't just statistics in a grim ledger of mortality. When we look back at medieval life expectancy, it's easy to feel superior, to congratulate ourselves on living in an age of antibiotics and vaccines and abundant food. And we should feel grateful. Modern medicine is genuinely miraculous, and most of us will live longer, healthier lives than medieval people could have imagined. But it's worth remembering that we're still mortal. We've pushed back death, made it less random and arbitrary, but we haven't eliminated it. We still face the same existential questions medieval people faced. How do we live meaningful lives in the face of certain death? How do we cope with grief and loss? How do we find courage when we're afraid? Medieval people didn't have our medical knowledge or our technology, but they had resilience, community, faith, and humor. They told stories to make sense of their world. They created rituals to mark important transitions. They supported each other through crisis after crisis, and they kept going, generation after generation, despite plague and famine and war, despite infant mortality and maternal death and genetic catastrophe. They kept having children, building communities, creating culture. They persisted. That persistence is worth acknowledging as we drift towards sleep. The medieval world was brutal and unfair and filled with preventable suffering. But the people who lived through it weren't just passive victims. They were survivors, ancestors. The reason any of us are here today, everyone listening to this had ancestors who survived the Middle Ages, who lived through the plagues and famines, who beat the 1 in 3 odds of childhood mortality. Your existence is proof that they made it, that they had children who survived, that the line continued unbroken through centuries of crisis. That's not nothing. That's actually kind of remarkable. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about those distant ancestors. Think about medieval peasants farming their fields, medieval mothers giving birth, medieval children playing in village streets. Think about the continuity of human experience, the things that connect us across centuries: love, fear, hope, the desire to survive and see our children survive, and be grateful. Grateful for antibiotics and vaccines, grateful for food security and modern obstetrics, grateful for the boring, everyday safety of modern life, the luxury of not constantly wondering if this illness or that injury will be the one that kills us. Medieval people would have envied us beyond measure. They would have seen our world as something close to paradise, a place where children usually survive, where mothers rarely die in childbirth, where a cut or a cough doesn't mean death. where people routinely live into their 70s and 80s, and that's considered normal, unremarkable. We live in the future they couldn't imagine. We've solved problems they thought were unsolvable. We've made death rarer, more distant, more manageable, and yet we still worry, still fear, still grieve when death comes, because mortality is the human condition, regardless of when or where we live. We can push it back, but we can't escape it. Medieval people understood that. They lived with it more intimately than we do, but the basic truth was the same. So rest easy tonight. You're safe, warm, fed, vaccinated against diseases that killed millions. You'll probably wake up tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. You'll probably live decades longer than your medieval ancestors could have hoped for. And when you do think about death, as we all do sometimes, in the quiet hours, remember that you're part of a long, unbroken chain of humans who've faced the same fears and asked the same questions. You're not alone in your mortality. You're connected to every person who's ever lived and died, including those medieval peasants and nobles and children we've spent the evening discussing. There's comfort in that continuity. There's meaning in being part of that ancient story of human survival. We are all just passing through, medieval peasant or modern listener, and we're all doing our best with the time we have. Sweet dreams, everyone. May your sleep be peaceful, your dreams gentle, and may you wake tomorrow grateful for antibiotics and the absence of plague. The Middle Ages were rough, but they're over now. We made it through. Time to rest. Soft fade, gentle closing, and if you found this helpful for drifting off, consider subscribing. There are plenty more historical periods to explore, plenty more stories to tell in this same calm, soporific style. Until next time, rest well.